The county inspector didn't even knock. He walked straight past the sobbing homeowner, pointed at the brand new guest house, and stapled a bright red notice to the front door. Then he said 7 words that made the entire neighborhood go silent. This structure is scheduled for demolition. The woman who'd spent 2 years bullying everyone on our street suddenly looked like she couldn't breathe. Her husband started yelling. Neighbors came out onto their porches. Someone pulled out a phone and started recording. And sitting 30 yards away on my property, I watched the panic spread across their faces. What they didn't know was that this moment had been building for almost 18 months. They thought they were stealing 12 feet of my land. They thought forged surveys, HOA connections, and endless intimidation would force me to surrender. They had no idea I was a retired military engineer whose grandfather had preserved every property document dating back nearly 70 years. The evidence had been waiting in a fireproof box the entire time. By the end of that afternoon, the guest house would be condemned, lawsuits would start flying, and the people who called me crazy would finally understand the truth. But before I tell you how they lost everything, let me show you how this nightmare started. My name is Daniel Harper, and at the time all of this happened, I was 58 years old and about 6 months into what I thought was going to be a quiet retirement. For nearly 3 decades, I worked as a military engineer. Most of my career was spent solving problems nobody noticed until something went wrong. Bridges, drainage systems, structural inspections, site planning. You learn to pay attention to details because details have consequences. A 1/4-inch mistake on paper can become a disaster in the real world. When I finally retired, I wasn't dreaming about beaches or golf courses. I came home. The property where this story takes place had been in my family longer than I'd been alive. My grandfather bought the original acreage shortly after returning from the war. Back then, this part of the county was mostly farmland, gravel roads, and families who knew each other well enough that nobody bothered locking their doors. Some of my earliest memories happened on that land. I learned to fish in a muddy little pond behind the oak grove. I spent summers chasing frogs along the creek banks and winters helping my grandfather split firewood beside his workshop. Every Thanksgiving, folding tables stretched across the backyard while cousins, uncles, and grandparents filled the property with noise that could probably be heard half a mile away. But the thing I remember most wasn't the pond or the gatherings. It was the boundary markers. That probably sounds strange unless you've known someone like my grandfather. Every spring he'd walk the perimeter carrying a bucket of bright orange paint. He'd inspect every iron pin and every survey monument like they were sacred objects. When I was a kid, I once asked why he cared so much. He tapped one of the markers with his boot and said, "People only ignore boundaries until they want something that belongs to somebody else." At the time, I thought it was just another one of his old sayings. Years later, I'd realize it was a warning. After my parents passed away, the property came to me. Not because I was the wealthiest member of the family or the most successful. I inherited it because everyone knew I'd protect it. The land wasn't valuable because of what it was worth on paper. It was valuable because it carried pieces of people I loved. When I moved back after retirement, I honestly believed my biggest challenge would be maintenance, repairing fences, clearing storm damage, keeping the old workshop standing. Meanwhile, the neighborhood around me was changing. Families I'd known for decades started selling. Large homes replaced modest ones. Luxury vehicles appeared in driveways where pickup trucks used to sit. The homeowners association grew larger, louder, and far more interested in controlling people's lives than preserving the community. At first I ignored it. I figured if I minded my business, everyone else would do the same. I thought this story would be about maintaining a piece of family history. Instead, it became a battle between legacy and entitlement, between patience and arrogance. And before it was over, one family's attempt to take what wasn't theirs would cost them far more than they ever imagined. I thought the biggest challenge would be maintaining the property. I was wrong. To understand why I fought as hard as I did, you need to understand what that property actually was. Most people looked at it and saw acreage. I saw people. My grandfather, Thomas Harper, bought the land in 1951. According to family stories, he paid for most of it with money he'd saved during the war, and the rest through a loan that took years to pay off. The original farmhouse wasn't much more than a weathered structure with a leaking roof and a stubborn wood stove, but he loved it from the moment he saw it. My grandmother used to joke that he fell in love with the land before he ever fell in love with her. Over the decades, every generation left a piece of themselves there. The creek running along the eastern edge of the property carried some of my earliest memories. In summer, the water moved slowly enough that kids could spend entire afternoons exploring it. My cousins and I built terrible little dams out of rocks that never lasted more than a day. We'd come back the next morning and discover the creek had quietly erased all our hard work overnight. My grandfather always laughed when that happened. "Nature keeps the final vote," he'd say. The northern side of the property was lined with massive oak trees, some older than anyone in the family. Their branches stretched so wide that they created entire rooms of shade underneath them. Every family reunion happened there, every graduation celebration, every 4th of July cookout. When people in my family talked about important life events, they usually measured them by which oak tree they happened under. Near the center of the property sat my grandfather's workshop. Even now I can still remember the smell inside. Motor oil, fresh-cut lumber, metal filings, coffee. It was the kind of place where something was always being repaired. Lawn mowers, fences, fishing gear, old tractors. If it broke, my grandfather tried to fix it before replacing it. Looking back, that workshop taught me as much about engineering as any classroom ever did. Then there was the meadow, a wide open stretch of grass on the western side that caught the afternoon sunlight perfectly. As a kid, it felt enormous. We'd play baseball there until sunset. During autumn, the field turned golden. During spring, wildflowers covered sections of it so densely they almost looked painted. Every corner of that property carried a story. That's why selling it was never really an option. People asked all the time, especially after development started spreading into the area. By the time I returned after retirement, farmland was disappearing faster every year. Large parcels were being divided into smaller lots. Builders were putting up expensive homes wherever they could find open space. The offers started arriving regularly. Some came in letters. Others came from real estate agents who somehow always seemed to know when I was outside working. A few developers became surprisingly persistent. One man offered what he called life-changing money. I remember standing beside the workshop while he explained how many houses could fit on the property. He talked about square footage, profit margins, future growth, investment opportunities. The entire time, he never once mentioned the creek, or the trees, or the families who had lived there. To him, it was a project. To me, it was home. So every offer got the same answer. No, sometimes politely, sometimes less politely. One thing many people don't realize is that property ownership isn't determined by where somebody thinks a boundary should be. It's determined by legal descriptions, recorded deeds, historical surveys, and established monuments. Fences can be wrong. Assumptions can be wrong. Even long-held beliefs can be wrong. The paperwork matters. The markers matter. The evidence matters. That's why my grandfather cared so much about those iron boundary pins. At the time, I viewed them as old pieces of metal buried in the ground, little reminders of a previous generation's obsession with details. I had no idea those forgotten markers would eventually become the most important objects on the entire property, and I definitely didn't know that someone was about to build a very expensive mistake because they ignored them. The first time I saw Melissa Carrington, she was standing in the middle of her new driveway directing movers like a battlefield commander. 3 trucks were parked outside the property next to mine. Workers carried furniture in and out while a black luxury SUV sat near the garage with temporary tags still attached. I remember watching from my workshop window while drinking coffee. At first, nothing seemed unusual. People moved in all the time. The difference was that most new neighbors spent their first few weeks trying to fit into the community. Melissa seemed determined to reorganize it. The Carringtons had purchased one of the largest lots in the neighborhood. The previous owners, an elderly couple named the Millers, had finally decided to move closer to their grandchildren after living there nearly 40 years. The week before they left, Mr. Miller had stopped by my property. "I don't think we're selling to people like us," he said quietly. At the time, I thought he was simply sad about leaving. A month later, I understood exactly what he meant. Melissa wasn't rude in the traditional sense. That would have been easier. Instead, she specialized in the kind of criticism disguised as concern. She'd compliment something before explaining why it needed improvement. She'd smile while pointing out flaws. She'd ask questions that weren't really questions. The first conversation we ever had happened while I was replacing a section of fence near my workshop. She walked over carrying a stainless steel water bottle and wearing expensive athletic clothes that looked like they had never encountered actual exercise. Her eyes moved across the property before she introduced herself. Not in a friendly way, in an evaluating way, like someone inspecting a purchase. "That's quite a workshop," she said. I thanked her. She nodded toward the building. It must hurt surrounding property values a little. I actually laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. When she realized I wasn't offended, she continued. The neighborhood is becoming much more upscale. People are investing serious money here now. I remember setting down my hammer and smiling. Well, the workshop has been there longer than either of us. She gave a small laugh. Not the kind people make when something is funny, the kind they make when they're politely disagreeing. That was my first lesson about Melissa. Everything was about appearances. The perfect lawn, the perfect landscaping, the perfect image. If reality didn't match the image she wanted, then reality needed to be adjusted. Over the following months, I noticed another pattern. She loved authority, or at least the appearance of authority. Every conversation somehow included references to HOA leadership, board meetings, architectural committees, community standards, neighborhood expectations. She dropped names constantly. I was speaking with the HOA president. The board agrees. The committee is reviewing. At first, I assumed she was simply active in community affairs. Then I started hearing the same stories from other neighbors. A retired teacher down the road rolled her eyes when Melissa's name came up. Just be careful, she told me. Careful of what? She likes being in charge of things that don't belong to her. I laughed. The teacher didn't. That should have been another warning. The first HOA letter arrived about 6 weeks later. According to the notice, someone had reported visual clutter near my workshop. The complaint referenced stacked lumber I was using for repairs. I cleaned it up and moved on. Then another letter arrived. Then another. One involved a trailer parked on my property. Another involved equipment storage. Another questioned whether part of a fence met updated aesthetic guidelines. Individually, none of them were serious. Together, they started feeling deliberate, especially because most of the alleged violations had existed for years without issue. One afternoon, while checking my mailbox, I noticed Melissa standing across the road talking with 2 HOA board members. All 3 glanced toward my property. The conversation immediately stopped when they saw me looking. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe it wasn't. At that point, I still wanted to believe people had better things to do with their lives. But other neighbors were beginning to notice the pattern too. A few quietly approached me. One warned me to document everything. Another suggested keeping copies of every HOA notice. A third simply shook his head and said, "She's already looking for her next project." I didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. Then one evening, Melissa stopped beside my driveway while I was checking irrigation lines. She looked across the property, toward the open meadow separating our land. For several seconds, she stared at the area where the old boundary markers were buried. Then she said something that seemed harmless at the time. "Things are changing around here." I wiped dirt from my hands. "They always do." She smiled. "Some people adapt better than others." Then she walked away. I remember watching her cross back onto her property. For some reason, my eyes followed hers. Not to the house, not to the road, to the line separating our land. And although I couldn't explain why, I had the uncomfortable feeling that she wasn't looking at my workshop anymore. She was looking at something she thought should belong to her. The real conflict began on a Tuesday morning. Not with lawyers, not with lawsuits, not even with the HOA. It started with a wooden stake. I noticed it while mowing the western edge of the property. At first, I assumed it belonged to a utility crew. Construction companies occasionally marked underground lines in the area, so seeing stakes wasn't unusual. What caught my attention was the location. The stake wasn't near the road. It wasn't near any utilities. It was planted several feet inside what I had always known to be my property. I shut off the mower and walked over. Bright orange ribbon fluttered from the top, freshly installed. I looked around and immediately spotted another one, then another, then another. A line, a very deliberate line, and it wasn't following the existing boundary. It was cutting into my land. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. By that afternoon, I had convinced myself there had to be some simple explanation. Maybe construction planning. Maybe drainage work. Maybe a surveying error that would be corrected once someone noticed it. Then Melissa showed up. She was standing near the stakes when I walked over, almost as if she'd been expecting me. "I was wondering when you'd see those," she said. I looked from her to the markers. "What are they?" "The new boundary." The way she said it made me blink. Not a possible boundary. Not a proposed boundary. The new boundary. I stared at her for a second. "What are you talking about?" She folded her arms. "We had a survey completed. Turns out the previous property line wasn't accurate." There was something oddly rehearsed about the statement, like she'd practiced saying it. I looked back at the stakes. The adjustment wasn't minor. The markers appeared to push the line inward by several feet. Enough land to matter. Enough land to raise serious questions. "Who performed the survey?" I asked. She shrugged. A licensed company. Can I see it? The smile disappeared almost immediately. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Why would you need to see our survey? That answer bothered me more than the stakes. Most reasonable people don't get defensive when asked for documentation supporting a major claim, especially a claim involving property boundaries. I kept my voice calm. If the survey changes where the property line sits, I'd like to understand how they reached that conclusion. Her expression hardened. The professionals already reached their conclusion. Then she turned around and walked away. That conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but it changed everything. That evening, I pulled my property deed from a filing cabinet in the house and spread it across the kitchen table. For the first time in years, I carefully reviewed the legal description. Measurements, bearings, reference points, corner monuments. Most people never read the legal descriptions attached to their property. They're dry, complicated, easy to ignore. But my engineering background made them familiar territory. The more I read, the less Melissa's claim made sense. Something wasn't adding up. The next morning, I walked the boundary myself, not with emotion, with a tape measure, a notebook, and questions. The temporary stakes consistently conflicted with measurements referenced in my deed, not by inches, by enough distance to create a serious discrepancy. I started making calls. The survey company refused to discuss details because I wasn't their client. Melissa ignored my requests for a copy of the survey. Then the HOA got involved. A letter arrived the following week. The wording was carefully crafted. Not an accusation, more of a suggestion. The association encouraged all parties to respect recently verified property boundaries while ongoing neighborhood improvements were being planned. I read that sentence 3 times. Recently verified. According to whom? Based on what? The letter never explained. Meanwhile, neighbors started noticing the situation. Some quietly agreed something felt off. Others assumed the survey must be correct because surveys sounded official. A few people began treating the issue like a settled matter before any actual evidence had been presented. That bothered me more than I expected. For the first time, a small amount of doubt crept into my thinking. Not because I believed Melissa was right, but because certainty can be dangerous. Engineering teaches you something important. The moment you become convinced you're incapable of being wrong is usually the moment you make your biggest mistake. So I considered the possibility. Maybe I had overlooked something. Maybe an older survey contained errors. Maybe a historical reference point had changed. Maybe I was defending a memory instead of a fact. But one thing kept nagging at me. If the evidence was truly on Melissa's side, why was she avoiding transparency? Why hide the survey? Why involve the HOA before sharing documentation? Why act like questions were a problem? As I dug deeper into county records, I stumbled onto something unexpected. Buried in archived property files was a reference to earlier survey documents tied to the original subdivision. Older records, much older, records dating back decades, and according to the county clerk, copies still existed. For the first time since those stakes appeared, I felt something besides frustration. I felt curiosity. Because if those original records said what I thought they might say, Melissa's new boundary was about to have a very serious problem. Looking back, I can see exactly when the disagreement stopped being about a boundary line and became something else. Pressure. Constant deliberate pressure. Within 2 weeks of discovering the survey dispute, the HOA notices started arriving with a frequency I'd never experienced before. For years, I'd barely heard from them. Now it felt like they knew my mailbox address by heart. The first notice claimed my grass exceeded community standards. That was interesting because I'd mowed it 3 days earlier. The second notice involved my storage shed. The shed had been sitting in the exact same location for nearly 20 years. Nobody had cared before. Suddenly it was a problem. Then came a parking complaint. Apparently my pickup truck had been parked in a position that was considered visually disruptive from the street. I remember reading that phrase twice. Visually disruptive. As if my truck was some kind of public emergency. A week later, another letter arrived regarding my mailbox. Not the condition of the mailbox. Not safety concerns. The color. At one point, I spread all the notices across my dining room table and just stared at them. Every individual complaint seemed minor, almost ridiculous. But together, they created a different effect. They consumed time, energy, attention. Every letter required a response. Photos, documentation, phone calls, emails, clarifications. Weeks passed like that, then months. And while I was busy defending myself against nonsense, the actual property dispute remained unresolved. which I suspect was exactly the point. One afternoon, I spotted Melissa standing near the road holding her phone toward my property. At first, I assumed she was texting. Then I noticed her slowly moving around and taking photographs. Not of the landscape, not of wildlife, of specific things. The workshop, equipment, the driveway, the shed. I watched for nearly 10 minutes. By the time she noticed me observing her, she had already taken dozens of pictures. When our eyes met, she didn't even seem embarrassed. She simply turned around and walked back home. That was the moment I decided to install security cameras, not because I thought anyone was going to break in, because something about the situation no longer felt normal. A retired engineer shouldn't need surveillance equipment just to understand what was happening on his own property. Yet there I was, mounting cameras beneath the workshop overhang and along the garage. At the time, I felt slightly ridiculous doing it. Later, I'd wish I had done it sooner. Around the same period, another problem emerged. The internet. A neighbor called me one evening. "Have you seen the community Facebook page?" I hadn't. "I rarely use social media." He paused. "You should probably take a look." I wish I hadn't. Someone had started posting complaints about an unnamed resident who was supposedly preventing neighborhood improvements. According to the posts, this mystery homeowner was difficult, unreasonable, confrontational, and obsessed with creating conflict. No names appeared. Not officially, but everyone knew who they were talking about. The timing made that obvious. Comments started piling up underneath. Some people supported the posts. Others questioned them. A few defended me. The worst part wasn't the criticism. It was the feeling of watching strangers discuss your character without knowing the facts. I wanted to respond. I wanted to argue. I wanted to post photographs and documents and explanations. Instead, I closed the page. Nothing good comes from fighting a rumor online. The rumor always has more free time than you do. Still, the damage lingered. At church, conversations felt shorter. At the grocery store, some people seemed strangely cautious around me. Not hostile, just uncertain. As if they weren't sure whether I was the person described online. I hated that feeling. For the first time since moving back, the property stopped feeling entirely peaceful. Sleep became harder. I'd wake up at 2 in the morning thinking about surveys. At 3 in the morning, I'd be reviewing documents. At 4 in the morning, I'd be imagining future legal bills. Stress has a strange way of shrinking your world. Problems start following you into every room. Even simple tasks become harder to enjoy. I found myself spending less time fishing, less time working on personal projects, less time appreciating the reasons I'd moved home in the first place. My daughter noticed before I did. During one phone call, she listened to me complain for nearly 15 minutes. Then she interrupted. "Dad." "What?" "You're letting these people live in your head rent-free." I laughed despite myself. She wasn't wrong. A few days later, my brother offered similar advice. "Get a lawyer." I resisted. Not because I couldn't afford one, because I still believed the situation could be resolved through conversation, documentation, common sense. I kept assuming reasonable people would eventually act reasonably. Melissa seemed to interpret that patience very differently. The more restrained I became, the more aggressive she became. More complaints appeared, more HOA involvement, more pressure. Then one evening, a neighbor I trusted stopped by unexpectedly. He stood on my porch looking uncomfortable. "What is it?" I asked. He hesitated. Then he glanced toward Melissa's property. "You know those complaints you've been getting?" "Yeah." "They aren't coming from different people." I felt my stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" He lowered his voice. "I was at an HOA committee meeting last week. Some board members were talking. Most of the complaints are connected." I stared at him. Connected? One word, but suddenly dozens of confusing events started fitting together. The notices, the photographs, the online posts, the pressure campaign, the timing, the coordination. For months I'd been treating every incident like a separate problem. That conversation forced me to confront a much darker possibility. This wasn't a series of random disputes. It was a strategy, and for the first time I began to suspect that the argument over the property line wasn't the end goal. It was just the beginning. About 3 weeks after my neighbor warned me that the complaints were connected, I woke up to the sound of diesel engines. At first I thought it was road work. Then I looked out my kitchen window. 2 excavators were parked on Melissa's property. A dump truck sat near the driveway, and several workers in reflective vests were unloading equipment. I remember standing there with a coffee mug in my hand, watching the activity unfold. Construction wasn't unusual in the neighborhood anymore. People were constantly renovating, expanding, or rebuilding. Still, Something about the timing bothered me. The property line dispute remained unresolved. The survey questions hadn't been answered. The HOA pressure campaign was ongoing. Yet somehow major construction was beginning right next to the disputed area. A few hours later, I got my answer. Melissa herself provided it. She spotted me checking my mailbox and practically floated across the road. For the first time in months, she looked genuinely excited. "We're building a guest house." I nodded politely. "That's a big project." She smiled. "Well, when family visits, we prefer having proper accommodations." The comment carried the usual hint of superiority she'd perfected. I ignored it. "What part of the property are you building on?" She pointed toward the open area separating our lots, the exact area that had become the center of the survey dispute. My stomach tightened immediately. Not because I knew something was wrong, because I suddenly had a feeling something was about to be wrong. Over the next few days, survey flags appeared again, then spray-painted markings, then utility locators. I spent several evenings standing near the western meadow, quietly observing where crews were placing markers. The more I watched, the less comfortable I became. The proposed building site sat unusually close to the disputed boundary, closer than most people would choose voluntarily, especially when ownership questions were still unresolved. One evening I pulled out aerial maps and property documents. The placement didn't make sense. If I were building a detached guest house on a large lot, I would have positioned it farther inward. Safer, simpler, less risky. Instead, they seemed determined to push the structure toward the very edge of the property, toward the line, toward the argument, toward me. The next morning, I contacted the county planning office. Nothing aggressive, just questions. I asked whether permits had been issued. The employee confirmed that applications existed but couldn't provide much additional information. I requested copies through the proper channels. Days passed. Responses came slowly. Some information arrived. Other information didn't. Whenever I asked specific questions about setbacks, boundary verification, or survey references, the answers became strangely vague. Nobody said anything was wrong, but nobody seemed eager to explain why everything was right either. Meanwhile, construction moved forward. Fast, much faster than I expected. Within days, excavation crews had cleared the site. Then came grading equipment, then compactors, then trucks hauling materials. Every morning I woke up to more progress. Every evening the structure seemed larger. The pace felt almost intentional, as if someone wanted the project too far along before objections could catch up. Then the concrete trucks arrived. I watched from my property as workers poured the foundation. That was the first moment genuine panic entered my thinking. Concrete changes things. A disagreement over plans is one thing. A disagreement over a finished foundation is something else entirely. Once concrete goes into the ground, every mistake becomes dramatically more expensive. I spent that evening reviewing measurements again, and again, and again. The numbers still refused to cooperate. The temporary survey stakes continued conflicting with deed descriptions. The foundation appeared dangerously close to where the original line should have been. Yet I couldn't prove it conclusively. Not yet. So I waited. Construction continued. Weeks passed. Walls appeared. Roof trusses arrived. The skeleton of the guest house rose into the air. For the first time, everyone in the neighborhood could see it, including me, especially me. One Saturday morning, I decided to conduct a more detailed measurement exercise. Nothing official, just engineering logic. Using fixed reference points from existing structures, known distances, historical maps, and property descriptions, I began comparing dimensions. The deeper I got, the worse the picture became. At first I thought I had made a mistake, so I checked everything again. Then again. Then again. Each calculation led to the same conclusion. The guest house wasn't simply close to the disputed boundary. It appeared to cross it, my boundary, by a significant amount. I remember sitting alone in my workshop staring at the measurements. The room felt strangely quiet. For months I'd worried Melissa might eventually try to claim part of my property. Now it looked like she had physically built on it, and if my calculations were correct, she hadn't accidentally crossed the line by a few inches. She'd crossed it by feet. Actual usable land. Actual ownership. Actual property. The kind of mistake that destroys projects. I spent 2 days trying to convince myself I was wrong. By the third day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. So I walked over and knocked on her door. Melissa answered immediately, almost like she knew why I was there. "I've been reviewing measurements," I said carefully. Her expression changed. Not surprised. Not confused. Annoyed. The guest house may be extending onto my property. For several seconds, she simply stared at me. Then she laughed. Actually laughed. Not because she found the situation amusing, because she found me amusing. You're still talking about that? I kept my voice calm. I'm serious. So am I. I asked whether she would share the survey documentation. Again, she refused. I asked whether she'd consider pausing construction until questions were resolved. Again, she refused. Then came the moment I still remember perfectly. She stepped forward, folded her arms and smiled. The kind of smile people wear when they think they've already won. Then she said, "Sue me if you think you're right." Nothing more. Just that. No explanation, no discussion, no compromise. Sue me. Then she closed the door. I stood on the porch for several seconds after she disappeared. Not angry. Not yet. Mostly stunned. Because in that moment something became painfully clear. This was no longer a disagreement between neighbours. This was no longer an HOA annoyance. This was no longer a misunderstanding that would be fixed with a conversation. A structure worth hundreds of thousands of dollars was being built near, or possibly across, a disputed boundary. Every day construction continued, the stakes increased. Every nail, every wall, every invoice, every permit, every decision, the situation was becoming harder to reverse. And for the first time since moving back home, I felt genuinely overwhelmed. Because if I was right, someone had just made an incredibly expensive mistake. And if I was wrong, I was about to spend a fortune proving it. Either way, there was no easy path forward anymore. The line had been crossed, possibly quite literally. For several days after my conversation with Melissa, I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. Nothing. At least that's how it looked from the outside. I still mowed the grass, still checked the mail, still worked in the workshop, but internally I was trying to answer a question that had become impossible to ignore. Was I reacting to facts, or was I reacting to emotion? The land carried so much family history that I couldn't completely trust my own instincts anymore. If someone had built near a property I didn't care about, would I be seeing the same problem? Or was my attachment clouding my judgment? Engineers are trained to distrust assumptions, including their own. So instead of calling a lawyer immediately, I decided to start where every good investigation starts. Evidence, real evidence, not memories, not opinions, not neighborhood gossip, documents. One Saturday morning, I unlocked a storage room attached to the workshop and pulled out something I hadn't opened since my father's funeral, a large fireproof cabinet. My grandfather bought it decades earlier. The thing weighed nearly as much as a refrigerator and looked sturdy enough to survive a small apocalypse. Growing up, I used to joke that he treated paperwork like treasure. Turns out he kinda did. Inside were neatly labeled folders spanning generations. Property records, tax documents, insurance paperwork, correspondence, maps, photographs. The farther I dug, the more fascinating it became. I found original deeds dating back decades, handwritten notes from surveyors, old maintenance records, receipts for fencing projects completed before I was born. Then I found something even better. Maps. Not modern digital maps, actual paper survey maps. Large yellowed sheets covered in measurements, bearings, and handwritten notations. Some were older than my parents. I spent hours studying them. Then I spent hours comparing them to current records. Patterns started emerging. Reference points remained remarkably consistent. The creek, the road, the corner monuments, the legal descriptions. The more documents I reviewed, the more uncomfortable I became with Melissa's so-called updated boundary. It simply didn't fit the historical record, but I still needed confirmation. Family documents alone weren't enough, so I drove to the county archives. If you've never visited a county records office, it's about as exciting as it sounds. Rows of filing cabinets, historical records, dust, silence, and surprisingly valuable information. Over the next 2 days, I reviewed archived plats, subdivision records, and historical survey documents tied to the surrounding properties. What I found raised even more questions. Several older records referenced physical monument markers placed during the original subdivision process. The same markers my grandfather had talked about for years, the same markers Melissa's survey never seemed interested in discussing. While researching, I was referred to a retired surveyor named Walter Jennings. Walter had spent more than 40 years working throughout the county before retiring. He wasn't involved in my dispute. He had no financial stake in the outcome, which made him exactly the kind of person I wanted to talk to. His office sat behind a modest house filled with old maps and framed aerial photographs. The moment I explained the situation, he leaned back in his chair and listened carefully. Then he asked one question. Did anybody locate the original monuments? I told him I didn't know. His eyebrows rose slightly. That reaction alone told me something. For nearly an hour, Walter walked me through the basics of boundary disputes. Not legal advice, just practical reality. One thing he explained stuck with me. Many people assume the newest survey is automatically the most accurate survey. That isn't always true. A survey is only as reliable as the reference points used to create it. If a surveyor relies on incorrect assumptions, missing markers, or flawed references, problems can follow. Then Walter said something that changed the entire direction of my thinking. Original monuments matter. He explained that when original survey monuments can still be located and verified, they often carry tremendous importance because they help establish the intent of the original boundary. In simple terms, the iron markers placed decades earlier could potentially carry more weight than newer interpretations built on questionable assumptions. Suddenly, my grandfather's obsession made perfect sense. Those weren't random pieces of metal. They were physical evidence. Evidence buried in the ground. Evidence nobody seemed eager to discuss. As Walter reviewed copies of my documents, additional inconsistencies emerged. Small things at first, measurements that didn't align, references that appeared missing, descriptions that seemed incomplete. Nothing dramatic on its own, but together they created a troubling picture. By the time I left his office, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope, not certainty. Hope. For the first time, the facts appeared to be moving in the same direction as my instincts. The property records, historical maps, archived surveys, original descriptions. Everything seemed to point toward the same conclusion. And if that conclusion proved correct, Melissa's guest house was sitting in a very dangerous position. That evening, I spread all the evidence across my dining room table. The documents no longer looked like random paperwork. They looked like pieces of a puzzle finally beginning to connect. Still, there was one problem. I wasn't a licensed surveyor. My calculations didn't matter in court. My opinions didn't matter in court. My suspicions didn't matter in court. I needed professionals, independent professionals, people whose findings could survive scrutiny. So the next morning I picked up the phone and hired an independent survey team. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was finally about to get an answer I could trust. The survey crew arrived on a cool Monday morning, just after sunrise. 3 trucks pulled into my driveway, and within minutes, equipment cases, tripods, GPS units, and measuring instruments were spread across the property. Watching them work was strangely reassuring. There was no drama, no opinions, no neighborhood politics, just professionals collecting facts. For months, it felt like everyone involved had been arguing about what they believed. Finally, someone was focused on what could actually be proven. The lead surveyor, a quiet man named Eric, spent nearly an hour reviewing the historical documents I'd gathered. The original deeds, the archived plats, the old maps, the survey notes from decades earlier. Unlike Melissa, he seemed genuinely interested in the older records, especially the references to monument markers. These could save us a lot of time, he said. At the time, I didn't realize how important that sentence would become. The first day passed mostly without incident. The second day didn't. Around mid-morning, Melissa appeared. Not casually, purposefully. She walked directly toward the survey crew while they were taking measurements near the disputed boundary. Even from a distance, I could tell she wasn't there to welcome them. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. Eric remained calm the entire time. Melissa didn't. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. Questions about why they were there. Questions about who hired them. Questions about whether they had permission. At one point, her voice became loud enough for me to hear clearly. That issue was already settled. Eric never raised his voice. Ma'am, we're simply conducting a survey. Simple, professional, unemotional. Exactly the response she didn't want. When the conversation ended, she stormed back toward her house. The crew went right back to work. That afternoon, something happened that completely changed the case. One of the survey technicians called Eric over. A few minutes later, Eric motioned for me to come take a look. At first, all I saw was a small hole in the ground. Then I noticed the metal, an iron pin. Old, weathered, buried beneath years of dirt and grass. One of the original boundary monuments. I felt a strange chill run through me. Not because of what it meant legally, because I instantly remembered my grandfather standing beside markers just like it. For years, those monuments had sat hidden beneath the surface while people argued above them. Now one had reappeared, and it wasn't alone. Over the next day and a half, additional original markers were located. Some were difficult to find. Some were buried surprisingly deep. But they were there, exactly where historical records suggested they should be. Intact, undisturbed, real. The moment those markers entered the equation, everything started changing. Measurements became more precise. Reference points became clearer. Questions began receiving answers. By Thursday afternoon, Eric asked me to join him near the completed measurement layout. I knew from his expression that something significant had happened. Still, I wasn't prepared for what he said. The guest house crosses the boundary. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the obvious question, how much? He looked down at his notes, then back at me. Approximately 12 feet. 12 feet. Not 12 inches. Not a minor discrepancy. 12 feet. I remember staring at the structure in silence. The building suddenly looked different. The same walls, the same roof, the same windows. Yet now all I could see was the section sitting where it had no legal right to be. Months of stress, months of uncertainty, months of wondering whether I was losing perspective. And suddenly there it was. An answer. Clear. Measured. Documented. Verifiable. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I mostly felt stunned. Because 12 feet wasn't a mistake someone accidentally overlooked. 12 feet represented a catastrophic problem, the kind of problem that lawyers get very interested in, which is exactly what happened. The completed survey report arrived several days later. The documentation was thorough. Measurements, photographs, coordinates, supporting evidence, historical references, everything professionally organized. I sent copies to an attorney recommended by a family friend. His reaction was immediate. Within 24 hours, he called me personally. Don't lose that report. Not exactly subtle. When an attorney sounds excited about paperwork, you know the paperwork is important. Soon afterward, Melissa received a copy through formal channels. I expected shock. Maybe concern. Possibly an attempt to negotiate. Instead, she doubled down, publicly. The survey was wrong. The surveyors were biased. The measurements were flawed. The process was unfair. Every explanation seemed to appear except the most obvious one, that she had built where she shouldn't have. Then the social media posts intensified, the complaints intensified, the rumors intensified. Apparently, I was now abusing the legal system. Apparently, I was attacking neighbors. Apparently, I was trying to destroy someone's property out of spite. The accusations became so exaggerated that even some people who disliked me started questioning them. One neighbor actually laughed when repeating a rumor he'd heard. Now they're saying you planned this whole thing years ago. That was the moment I realized something important. People become reckless when facts stop supporting them. And Melissa was becoming increasingly reckless. Because beneath all the noise, all the complaints, and all the neighborhood drama, one reality remained unchanged. The guest house was still 12 feet onto my property. The report wasn't going away. The evidence wasn't disappearing. And for the first time since this began, I had something stronger than suspicion. I had proof. A week later, my attorney filed the first formal legal action. The dispute had officially left the neighborhood. Now it was headed somewhere Melissa couldn't control. And that was exactly when things started getting interesting. If the survey was the moment the facts became clear, the legal battle was the moment everyone was forced to pick a side. Up until then, most people in the neighborhood had managed to stay comfortably neutral. Some privately agreed with me. Some privately supported Melissa. Most simply wanted the conflict to disappear. Lawsuits have a way of destroying neutrality. Once attorneys become involved, people stop treating a dispute like neighborhood gossip and start realizing there may be real consequences attached to what they say and do. The first official filing went out less than 2 weeks after the independent survey was completed. My attorney requested corrective action, challenged the encroachment, and included the survey findings as supporting evidence. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical. Just documentation, facts, measurements, legal arguments. The response arrived quickly, and it told us everything we needed to know. Melissa wasn't interested in solving the problem. She intended to fight. Hard. Not long afterward, the HOA board publicly inserted itself into the dispute. That decision surprised me. It also turned out to be one of the worst mistakes they made. An official community communication was circulated encouraging residents to avoid disruptive misinformation regarding established property improvements. The wording was carefully crafted. No names were mentioned, but everyone understood the target. Me. I remember reading the statement twice and shaking my head. The irony was almost impressive. The one side, carrying survey evidence, historical records, and legal documentation, was being accused of spreading misinformation. Meanwhile, the side with a building crossing a boundary line was being treated as the victim. For a while, that frustrated me. Then my attorney gave me advice that changed my perspective. Let them keep talking. What if people believe them? He shrugged. Eventually, evidence gets a turn. I held on to that sentence for months, because there were days when evidence felt painfully slow. The court system doesn't move at internet speed. It moves at court speed, documents, responses, deadlines, reviews. Weeks disappear, then months. Meanwhile, the guest house remained standing. Every time I looked out toward the property line, I saw the structure sitting there like a monument to arrogance. A very expensive monument. The court eventually ordered mediation before moving deeper into litigation. For anyone unfamiliar, mediation is basically an attempt to resolve disputes without a full courtroom war. A neutral party helps both sides explore possible solutions. In theory, it saves time, money, stress. I entered the process genuinely willing to compromise. Not surrender, compromise. I wasn't demanding punishment. I wasn't demanding revenge. I simply wanted the encroachment addressed. There were several potential solutions: boundary adjustment, property purchase, structural modification, relocation. None were ideal, but legal disputes rarely produce ideal outcomes. Melissa rejected every meaningful proposal, every single one. At one point, she started arguing that she effectively had rights to the disputed area because it had supposedly been treated as part of her property. The argument made so little sense that even the mediator looked confused. Her attorney quickly tried to reframe it as a form of adverse possession discussion. That wasn't much better. For those unfamiliar, adverse possession isn't some magical legal shortcut that allows people to claim land because they want it. Generally speaking, it requires very specific conditions, long periods of open occupation, and strict legal requirements that vary by jurisdiction. It's not something that suddenly appears because a new structure was recently built across a disputed boundary. Even I knew that, and I wasn't the lawyer in the room. The mediation ended exactly where it began. Nowhere. Once litigation accelerated, information started emerging that nobody had seen before. And that's when the situation became genuinely uncomfortable for Melissa. Court filings brought documents into the open. Emails, communications, permit records, timeline details. Things that had previously remained hidden. One discovery immediately caught everyone's attention. There were indications that concerns about the boundary had been raised far earlier than Melissa publicly admitted. Not definitive proof of intent, but enough to raise serious questions. Questions became a recurring theme. Why continue construction when ownership concerns existed? Why push forward before disputes were resolved? Why ignore requests for transparency? Why refuse independent verification? Then permit issues started surfacing. Nothing explosive. No dramatic criminal conspiracy. Just irregularities. Missing clarifications. Incomplete references. Details that suddenly attracted attention once lawyers and experts began reviewing them. The deeper attorneys dug, the more expensive the process became. And legal expenses don't care who's winning. They arrive regardless. Depositions began several months later. Those sessions changed the tone of everything. For the first time, people weren't posting opinions online. They were giving sworn testimony. Very different environment. Very different consequences. Neighbors who had quietly observed events were questioned. Some described Melissa's behavior. Others discussed HOA involvement. A few testified about the survey dispute itself. Several people recalled hearing concerns raised long before construction was completed. Then former HOA members entered the picture. That surprised me. Apparently not everyone inside the association had agreed with how things were handled. One former board member testified that internal disagreements had existed regarding the dispute. Another questioned whether the association should have become involved at all. Each testimony felt small by itself. Together they created a pattern. And patterns matter. Throughout the process, I focused on staying calm. Not because I was naturally calm. I wasn't. Plenty of nights I wanted to scream. Plenty of mornings I woke up angry. But emotional outbursts rarely help legal cases. Documentation helps legal cases. Facts help legal cases. Patience helps legal cases. So I stuck to facts. Measurements, records, evidence. Melissa seemed to move in the opposite direction. The longer the case continued, the more emotional she became. Arguments that once sounded confident began sounding defensive. Defensive arguments became angry arguments. Angry arguments became accusations. At one hearing, she became visibly frustrated when technical evidence contradicted her claims. At another, she interrupted proceedings often enough that even her own attorney appeared uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the financial pressure kept growing. Legal bills mounted. Expert witness costs mounted. Consulting fees mounted. And then another problem emerged. The loan. Word began spreading that questions surrounding the property dispute were creating complications connected to financing and property valuation. That got people's attention fast. Neighborhood gossip had survived for months. Financial consequences changed the conversation overnight. Suddenly, people who hadn't cared about surveys started caring very much, because everyone understood money. By then, community sentiment had begun shifting. Not dramatically, gradually. The same neighbors who once viewed the dispute as a petty disagreement started seeing something different. A homeowner had raised concerns. Those concerns had been dismissed. An independent survey had confirmed them. The evidence kept holding up, and despite months of resistance, nobody had managed to explain away 12 feet. Not 1 inch, not 1 foot. 12 feet. As winter approached, the atmosphere around the neighborhood felt completely different than it had at the start of the dispute. The confidence Melissa once projected was fading. Questions were multiplying. Support was shrinking. And for the first time since that first orange survey stake appeared in the grass, it felt like the truth was finally catching up to everyone involved. The only thing left was to see what would happen when those facts reached a courtroom. The hearing took place on a rainy Thursday morning. I remember the weather because it matched exactly how I felt. Heavy, quiet, uncertain. People often imagine courtroom victories as dramatic movie scenes where everyone already knows who's going to win. Real life doesn't work that way. You can have strong evidence, strong arguments, strong witnesses, and still spend the entire drive to the courthouse wondering whether something unexpected is about to go wrong. I arrived early. My attorney was already there reviewing documents. Boxes of documents. Months of surveys. Property records. Depositions. Photographs. Maps. Legal filings. An entire year of conflict compressed into stacks of paper. What surprised me most wasn't the evidence. It was the crowd. Word had spread throughout the community. Several neighbors attended. Former HOA members attended. Even people who had avoided the dispute for months suddenly seemed interested in the outcome. Apparently, 12 feet of disputed property had become local entertainment. Across the room, Melissa sat beside her attorney. For the first time since this began, she looked different, not defeated, but strained. The confidence she'd carried throughout the dispute wasn't gone. It was just working harder than before. The hearing began with procedural matters before moving into testimony. Then the survey experts took the stand. And that's when things started changing. The lead surveyor walked the court through the investigation step by step. No emotion, no exaggeration, just methodology. Reference points, measurements, historical verification, physical monument recovery. The judge asked detailed questions. The surveyor answered everyone, patiently, clearly, professionally. Then photographs of the original monument markers were introduced. Images of the iron pins, images showing excavation, images documenting location verification, images connecting historical records to physical evidence. As the presentation continued, I noticed something. The judge was taking notes constantly. Not casual notes, focused notes, the kind people take when they are paying very close attention. Then came the documents from my grandfather's archive. Honestly, I hadn't expected them to become such an important part of the case. At first they were simply supporting evidence. Historical context, background information. But once attorneys began connecting those records to the recovered monuments, everything became much more significant. Old survey maps were displayed, handwritten notations, historical descriptions, maintenance records, boundary references. The documents created a timeline stretching back decades, and every piece pointed in the same direction. The original boundary had remained remarkably consistent. Suddenly, what Melissa's side had been calling an outdated interpretation started looking a lot like the actual historical reality. By comparison, the opposing survey began attracting uncomfortable questions. Lots of uncomfortable questions. The judge asked how certain reference points had been selected. Questions followed about assumptions used during preparation. Questions about monument verification. Questions about conflicting historical records. I watched Melissa's survey expert become increasingly cautious with his answers. Not hostile. Careful. Very careful. And in court, careful answers can sometimes be more revealing than confident ones. The longer the testimony continued, the more tension appeared at Melissa's table. Whispers between attorneys, frequent note passing, repeated consultations. The atmosphere felt different, like everyone could sense momentum shifting. Then came the contradictions. Some emerged from deposition testimony. Others emerged from documentation. A few emerged from prior statements that didn't align cleanly with later claims. Individually, they weren't devastating. Collectively, they were. The narrative Melissa had relied on for months began developing cracks, then larger cracks, then visible fractures. For the first time, I saw genuine nervousness, not frustration, not anger, nervousness. She stopped making eye contact with people in the gallery, stopped looking toward the audience, stopped projecting certainty. Meanwhile, HOA representatives sitting several rows back looked increasingly uncomfortable. The association had spent months publicly supporting her position. Now they were watching evidence move in a direction they clearly hadn't expected. Then the moment happened, the moment everyone remembered afterward. The judge leaned forward and looked toward the opposing side. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Even the spectators seemed to sense something important was coming. Then the judge asked a simple question, a devastatingly simple question. If the original monument markers were still present, recoverable, documented, and consistent with the historical property records, he paused, then continued. Why were they not verified before construction proceeded? Silence. Not movie silence, real silence. The kind that feels uncomfortable because nobody has an immediate answer. I looked across the room. Melissa stared forward. Her attorney flipped through documents. The survey expert shifted in his seat. Nobody spoke. A few seconds passed, then several more. The judge waited. The answer never really came. Not a convincing one anyway. What followed was a collection of explanations, assumptions, qualifications, and technical language. But everyone in the room understood what had just happened. The question wasn't complicated, and the response wasn't satisfying. You could almost feel the realization spreading through the courtroom. Neighbors who had doubted me. People who had remained neutral. Even individuals who had quietly supported Melissa. The facts were no longer competing. One version of events was holding together. The other was struggling. When proceedings adjourned later that afternoon, the atmosphere felt completely different from the morning. The confidence that had carried Melissa through months of conflict had visibly eroded. The HOA representatives left quickly. Spectators gathered in small groups discussing testimony. My attorney packed documents without saying much. Then he finally looked at me and smiled. Not a celebration, not a victory speech, just a small smile, because we both knew something important had happened. The case wasn't over yet. The ruling hadn't been issued, but for the first time since the dispute began, it felt like the truth had finally entered the room, and nobody could push it back out. The ruling arrived 3 weeks later, not in some dramatic courtroom ambush, not with surprise witnesses or last-minute revelations, just a scheduled hearing on a quiet morning that would end up changing everything. The courtroom wasn't as crowded as before, but plenty of familiar faces were there. Neighbors, former HOA members, people who had spent the better part of a year watching this dispute unfold from a distance. Everyone knew the same thing. Today there would finally be an answer. The judge spent several minutes reviewing the findings, property records, survey evidence, historical documentation, recovered monument markers, expert testimony. Piece by piece, he summarized the facts that had emerged throughout the case. Then came the conclusion. The encroachment was confirmed. Officially, unequivocally. The guest house extended onto my property. There was no ambiguity left, no competing interpretation, no unresolved question. The structure had been built across a boundary that did not belong to them. I expected relief when I heard those words. Instead, I felt strangely calm, almost numb. Maybe because I'd been carrying the certainty for months already. The court was simply catching up to what the evidence had shown long ago. Then the judge addressed remedies. That's when the room became very quiet. The unlawful portion of the structure could not remain. Corrective action would be required. The legal path forward was outlined clearly, and ultimately the order included removal of the encroaching structure. In simple terms, the guest house had to go. I heard a sharp inhale from somewhere behind me, then another. Across the room, Melissa's face seemed to lose color. For months, she had acted as if consequences were impossible. Now those consequences were sitting directly in front of her. Her husband immediately stood and began arguing. Not aggressively, desperately. He talked about costs, time, hardship, investment, the amount of money already spent. The judge listened respectfully, then reminded him of something painfully simple. Construction decisions do not override property rights. The law didn't suddenly change because a project became expensive. County officials later explained the practical consequences. Permits would be affected. Compliance deadlines would apply. Additional financial obligations would follow. The process wasn't optional. For the first time since I'd met her, Melissa looked completely defeated. Not angry, not defiant. Defeated. A year earlier, she had laughed when I raised concerns. Months later, she told me to sue her. Now, she sat silently while the reality of the situation settled in. As people filed out of the courtroom, conversations erupted everywhere. Neighbors whispered. Reporters took notes. Former HOA supporters looked stunned. I simply remained seated for a moment. Not because I was celebrating. Honestly, I wasn't. Watching someone's mistake destroy hundreds of thousands of dollars isn't enjoyable, even when they created the problem themselves. What I felt wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge. It was vindication. The evidence had mattered. The truth had mattered. And after months of being treated like the unreasonable one, that quiet acknowledgement meant more than any celebration ever could.